Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking about you and your business. Got Emily Goff on from the Heritage Foundation. She's been on several times before. Always does a great job and full of energy as well as information. And unlike me, which is just typically full of it. Hey, Emily, glad to have you on. How are you?
It's great to be here. Good introduction with that.
Yeah, you bet. So 3 whoppers from Obama's economic speech. We're hoping that, everyone hasn't eaten yet because some of these things are rather sickening. Of course, he wants to talk about the economy, and he actually believes that this is an economy he can boast about. That's the part I find so puzzling about it. And, of course, the low information voter out there, a.k.a. sheeple, are totally buying into it. Many of them are, at least. What do you think?
We really heard the same kind of worn-out economic speech that we've been hearing for 5 years now. And we might hear it for the next couple of years, to be quite honest. The president really made a lot of claims in his speech yesterday that just aren't true. I can touch on one of them first. He said that Obamacare is going great. We've heard this before. This is his signature piece of legislation. But if you actually look at what's been happening in the news over the last couple of years, you see the exact opposite. You have states that are resisting the Medicaid expansion because they know that they're going to be saddled with unsustainable costs in the future. Congress repealed one portion of Obamacare called the Class Act, which was going to be a long-term and care entitlement because, again, it was unsustainable. We couldn't afford it. You've got deadlines being missed, and yet the president is ignoring all those things and still trudging right along saying, yep, things are looking good.
Yeah, actually, I do think Obamacare is doing better than it was before. I mean, now they're not even going to implement the mandates. That's got to be a good thing. Sorry, sometimes I'm ridiculous. But, the more this thing fails, the better it is for the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. The worst case scenario would be for this to start going into effect, and then what you have then is an entitlement that has begun its life cycle. And it's going to be very, very difficult for members of Congress to reverse course once that's actually taken hold. Look at the case of Social Security and Medicare right now, the two of the biggest entitlements we have.
Well, he's gambling big time, isn't he? Because now he's pushing it to such a point where, if things don't go well in 2014 and you get a Republican majority, he's gambling a Democratic majority really in both houses in some respects, because that's why he's delaying it. But if he ends up getting a Republican majority in both houses, which I think Republicans, in spite of their best efforts, are poised to win both houses, but in spite of their best efforts to make sure they lose both houses, he's really up the creek. There's a chance that he could lose Obamacare entirely.
Well, if you look at what we saw when this was first implemented. I mean, Nancy Pelosi famously said we have to pass it to see what's in it. I think that they're figuring out now that a lot of it was truly unworkable, and what they really should be doing is going back to the drawing board, getting rid of Obamacare, repealing it, going back to the drawing board and actually crafting health care reforms that work, that are pro-market, that introduce competition and put employers and patients actually in charge of their own health care decisions, not bureaucrats in Washington.
Yeah, it's just really quite ridiculous. It's really sad that these people don't seem to understand economics, basic economics, and the hubris. Here we have a $17 trillion debt, and they're adding more debt upon debt in order to implement this type of thing, and they want to call it good government. It's really mind-boggling.
I know, that really actually gets to one of the other whoppers I wanted to mention too, is that the president said, I cut the deficit in half. Now this year we're going to see a deficit.
Sorry.
We're going to see a deficit this year over $600 billion. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, as the saying goes, to figure out that that's unsustainable. And if you put this in context, sure, the president can say that he cut the deficit in half, but guess what? He ran the deficit up to over $1 trillion, to $1.4 trillion at one point in 2009. So by that logic, sure, maybe we cut the deficit in half, but kind of the same logic of Obamacare, we had to run up the deficit. We had to run up the deficit before we could cut it.
Yeah, that's kind of a sad tell. I mean, so when he says he cut the deficit, in what time frame is he talking about?
During his time in office. So if you
But that's not true.
Well, like I said, if you look at where the deficit was in 2009 at 1.4 trillion, so half of that would be about where we're going to run this year. But again, getting back to your point about defying economics, I mean, this is really it's irresponsible to be running deficits this great, and then to talk in the same speech about the need to invest, aka spend more, in things like transportation, infrastructure, education. These are not roles of the federal government. This is what states and local governments and the private sector should be doing, not Washington. We can't afford it.
Yeah, Washington, and they can't do it effectively either, can they?
No, not at all. The waste and fraud and abuse, of course, that's small change, in the grand budget scheme, but that's just one small indications of the way that Washington poorly manages taxpayer resources.
Yeah, I do want to mention that you can find an article about this over at usdailyreview.com, written by one of your colleagues. What was the third point of that about the middle class, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That the middle class income is stuck in the 1970s. Again, we saw the president resorting to his class warfare tactics, which he does when he wants to distract from large issues. So here he said that he wants to save the middle class, and it's that 1% that we have to protect everyone else from. He said that the income of the top 1% quadrupled since 1979, but the typical family, your American middle-class family's income barely budged. If you actually look at the data, and we've looked at Congressional Budget Office data, even researchers over at the Brookings Institution, which is a center-left organization, the bottom line is that the middle class is not disappearing. Income of these middle class Americans has actually increased by almost 40%. So Americans are being more productive. We're being better compensated. The president's claim just isn't true. Interesting.
Yet the average income of Americans did shrink during the first 4 years of his administration.
Yes, and part of that's because of the poor state of the economy, which you could point to government stimulus and government meddling as hindering economic growth. So really we have the president to thank for the fact that, in part, the fact that there are so many Americans still out of work today. It's his vision of a big government, more government spending, the threat of tax increases that has really hampered economic growth and discouraged businesses from hiring that additional worker, partly because they don't know what their tax burden is going to be in the future. Yeah,
this is definitely the case. All right, as always, Emily Goff does a fine job every time she comes on this program, this time with 3 whoppers from Obama's economic speech. We have an article by Heritage over there at usdailyreview.com in the featured section. Make sure you check it out. As always, thanks for being with us.
Great to be on today. Thanks.
All right, when we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you, best content here does show up over there at usdailyreview.com, including this great interview with Emily. Stay tuned for more right after this on The Price of Business.